The wolf was already at the fence when Elena woke up. She had not heard it arrive. She had not heard anything at all, and that was what pulled her out of sleep at 4 in the morning, the silence. 3 years living on the edge of the Blackthorn Wilderness Reserve in Montana had taught Elena Carr to read silence the way other people read words. And this silence was wrong. She sat up in the dark, her breath visible in the cold air of the cabin. The heating unit had cut out again overnight. Her wool socks were on the floor beside the bed, her field notebook open on the pillow next to her, a pen still clipped to the page where she had fallen asleep mid-sentence. She was 34 years old, and she lived alone, and she had chosen that. She reminded herself of that often, especially in the winters. She moved to the window without turning on a light. Experience had taught her that. You did not announce yourself in the dark. You looked first. The wolf was standing at the edge of the clearing, right at the wooden post fence she had put up 2 summers ago, not to keep animals out but to mark where the cleared ground ended and the tree line began. The animal was large, a female she had been tracking for 14 months, gray with a white chest marking that made her easy to identify from a distance. Elena had recorded her in the field logs as Mira, unofficial names being something she was not supposed to use but always did. Mira was not alone. There was a child beside her. Elena did not move for 3-4 seconds. Her brain was doing what brains do in moments that do not make sense. It was searching for the explanation that fit inside the laws of normal things. A child out here, at this hour, in November. No, that was not a normal thing. Then the child moved, and Elena saw the yellow raincoat, torn at one shoulder, and the child was small, no taller than 3.5 feet, and sitting in the snow with both hands flat on the ground, and Mira was standing over her, not touching her, just standing there. Elena grabbed her coat off the hook by the door, shoved her feet into her boots without lacing them, and stepped outside. The cold hit her face like a hand. It was well below freezing. The snow was blue-white in the moonlight, unmarked except for 2 sets of prints coming in from the east, wolf prints and small boot prints, side by side, sometimes overlapping, for as far as she could see. She crossed the clearing in 10 steps. Mira lifted her head and looked at Elena with the flat, calm gaze that Elena had come to know well. Not aggression. Not fear. Something harder to name. Then Mira turned and walked back toward the trees without hurrying, stopped once at the fence post and looked back, and then was gone into the dark. The child was a girl. Dark hair, both eyes open and watching Elena with an expression that was not fear either, which surprised her. She was shaking with cold, her lips pale, her small hands red. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply looked at Elena as if she had been waiting. Elena crouched down to her level. She said, softly, "My name is Elena. You are safe. I am going to bring you inside now, okay?" The girl did not answer. But she did not pull away when Elena picked her up, and she pressed her cold face immediately against Elena's neck, and Elena felt something move in her chest that she had been very carefully not feeling for a long time. Inside, she called the ranger station. Then she called the county emergency line. Then she wrapped the girl in 2 blankets and sat her on the heater bench and made hot water from the kettle and found the only thing that could reasonably be given to a small child at 4 in the morning, which was a packet of plain crackers, and the girl ate 3 of them without a word. It took the emergency team 40 minutes to reach the cabin. During those 40 minutes, Elena sat on the floor in front of the bench and talked quietly, telling the girl about the wolves she studied, about the mountain, about the way snow looked different at every hour of the day. The girl listened. She never spoke. But she stopped shaking about 15 minutes in, and at some point she reached out and put one small hand on Elena's knee, and she left it there. Her name, the ranger told Elena later, was Daisy. She was 4 years old. She had wandered away from a family campsite 11 kilometers to the east sometime after 9 the previous evening. The family had been searching through the night. Her father had not stopped moving since he noticed her missing. Her mother had not stopped crying. Daisy was reunited with her family by 6:30 in the morning. She was physically fine, cold, hungry, a small scratch on one cheek, but no worse than that. 11 kilometers in the dark. November. Below freezing. And she was fine. The ranger, a solid, quiet man named Leonard Cole who had been walking the Blackthorn Range for 9 years, stood in Elena's doorway after the family had gone and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "The wolf brought her here," Elena said. "It is in my field log. I have the time of first observation, Myra's ID markings, the tracks, I can show you." Leonard looked out at the clearing where the tracks were still visible. Then he looked back at Elena. "I believe you," he said simply. And then he left. Elena went back inside. She poured herself a cup of cold coffee, sat at the small table by the window, and opened her field notebook. She wrote down everything she had observed: Myra's position, behavior, gaze, the direction of her departure. She wrote down the child's arrival, condition, and the joint track pattern in the snow. She wrote it all down in the careful, precise language she had been trained to use. Then she sat for a moment with her pen not moving, and she looked out the window at the tree line where Myra had disappeared. She had studied wolf behavior for 11 years. She had her doctorate from the University of Colorado. She had published 4 peer-reviewed papers and presented at 2 international conferences. She knew wolf cognition, wolf communication, wolf territorial behavior, and wolf social structure well enough to teach it, and she had. And she could not explain what she had just seen in any of the frameworks she owned. She wrote one line at the bottom of the page, outside the formal log section, in her own handwriting. Why would she bring the child here? She underlined it once. Then she closed the notebook and went to make more coffee, and outside the Montana winter sat still and white and full of things she did not yet understand. The second child arrived in March. Elena had almost convinced herself that the November incident was a singular event, an anomaly, the kind of thing that happened once in a lifetime in the wilderness and then became a story people told at conferences while shaking their heads in disbelief. She had filed her official report. She had noted it in her research logs as an observed anomalous behavior event. She had not told anyone beyond what the official record required, partly because she valued her professional reputation and partly because she could hear exactly how it sounded. "A wolf brought a lost child to my door." Yes. In the middle of the night. No, I cannot explain it. She was not willing to be that person. Not yet. March in Montana still meant snow on the ground, but it was a different kind of cold, wetter, less absolute, the kind that got into your joints. She was out on a morning track, following the Blackthorn Pack's eastern movement toward the ridge where they had been denning late in the season. She had her field pack, her camera, her notebook, her radio. She was wearing the orange and brown layers that she had learned, through 3 winters, were best for moving through the kind of terrain that did not care whether you lived or died. She heard the bark first. Not a howl, a short, sharp, repeated sound, and she recognized it as belonging to one of the younger males in the pack, a 2-year-old she had been watching develop his role in the hierarchy. She had not given him a name yet. She was trying to be better about that. She moved toward the sound carefully, staying downwind, moving slow. She came over a ridge and stopped. The young male was standing at the base of a frozen creek bed. Beside him, sitting on a rock with both knees pulled to his chest, was a boy. He looked about 6 years old, and his left ankle was at an angle that made Elena's stomach drop the moment she saw it. He was pale and very still, and he was looking at the wolf the way children sometimes look at things they cannot explain, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of total absorption, as if the wolf had asked him a question he was still thinking about. When he heard Elena's boots on the snow, he looked up. His face went through several things very quickly. Relief was the last one, and it settled there. "My name is Oliver," he said. "I think I broke my ankle." She was across the creek bed in seconds. She introduced herself, kept her voice even, checked the ankle without moving it, and radioed the ranger station while she shrugged off her outer jacket and wrapped it around him. The young male wolf had moved back about 20 feet and sat down in the snow and watched all of this with the same expression Myra had worn in November, that calm, assessing look that was almost impossible to assign a simple label to. Oliver had gone hiking with his father, who had stopped to fix a bootlace on a narrow section of trail and looked up to find his son had gone on ahead and around the bend and was simply not there anymore. The father had been searching for over an hour when Elena's radio call went through. He arrived at the pickup point 16 minutes before the ranger medics did, and he picked up his son and held him and didn't say a single word for a very long time. Leonard Cole stood with Elena by the ranger truck while the medics worked. "That is the second time," he said. Elena said nothing. He looked at her. "Different wolves. Mira last time. The young male today, I do not have a designation for him yet, he is still developing his pack role, but I know his markings. Different wolves, same pack." Leonard was quiet for a moment. "Same pack," he said, almost to himself. The Blackthorn pack had a loose territory of about 260 square kilometers. There was no shortage of human trails running through parts of that range. Families hiked there in spring and summer. People got lost all the time. And wolves were not rare in the Blackthorn. Elena monitored 6 distinct individuals regularly, with the full pack estimated at 12 to 14 members. But in 9 years of working this range, Leonard told her later, he had never had a wolf bring a person to a location where another person could find them. Not once. It simply was not something that happened. Except that it was happening. The third incident came in May. Twin girls, ages 7 and 9, led by a black and gray female, not Mira, to the fence line of Elena's cabin just before dusk on a Saturday. Their mother was running a trail 12 kilometers west and had sent them ahead to the car park where she finished the last section, and somewhere between the trail end and the car park the girls had taken a wrong turn and walked for nearly 2 hours before the wolves found them. Found them. Elena kept using that word in her logs and kept stopping and underlining it, because it implied a search, and a search implied intent, and intent implied something that her training said she was not supposed to project onto animal behavior without hard evidence. But the evidence was accumulating. The fourth incident was a toddler, barely 2 years old, not yet fully verbal, somehow separated from his parents during a family picnic near the north boundary of the reserve. The boy was found by a park juvenile and delivered to the cabin clearing in exactly the same fashion as the others, calmly, without aggression, and then departed immediately once Elena appeared. By the time the fourth child was back safely with his family, the story had leaked. Elena was not sure who had told it, possibly Leonard, possibly one of the parents who had given an interview to a local paper. But a journalist in Missoula had stitched the 4 events together into a single story with a headline that made Elena close her laptop and press both hands flat on the desk. "Wolves in Montana keep rescuing lost children. And they all bring them to the same woman." The story moved fast. It was on the national news within 48 hours. It was shared over 200 million times in its first week. The photograph someone had taken from a distance, blurry, dark, but unmistakably showing Mira standing beside Daisy in the snow while Elena crossed the clearing, became one of those images that people share because it makes them feel something they cannot name. Elena did 3 interviews and then stopped doing interviews. She said the same thing in all 3, wolves are not pets. This behavior is not normal and should not be encouraged. Do not approach wild wolves. The park is being monitored by a licensed researcher and all incidents have been reported to the appropriate wildlife authorities. What she did not say in any interview was the thing that was keeping her up past midnight most nights, the thing she wrote and rewrote in her private journal without ever finding the right words for it. In all 4 incidents, the wolves had not brought the children to the nearest human structure, or the nearest road, or the nearest trail. There were ranger stations closer in 2 of the 4 cases. There was a main road within 2 kilometers of the third incident site. They had brought every child to her cabin. To her window light. To her specifically. And at every single handoff, she was using that word now, handoff, and she knew what it implied. The alpha male had been in the tree line. Watching. Never approaching. Never visible unless you knew what to look for. She had only noticed him for certain in the second incident, and then gone back through her notes and found evidence of his presence at the first one too. By the fourth, she was watching for him, and there he was, every time. She had designated him Alpha K in her research logs because Alpha was his pack role and K was for king, and she had called him king the first time she tracked him 2 years ago because there was something about the way he moved through the pack hierarchy, not with dominance exactly, but with a settled, absolute confidence, that had made her think of that word before she could stop herself. He was silver gray and very large for the species, with a scar across his left shoulder that she had photographed in detail over 2 field seasons. He never moved toward the cabin. He never came forward to be seen. He simply watched, assessed, and disappeared. She stood at the tree line one evening in late May, not following him, not walking, just standing. And she said quietly, into the dark, "What are you doing?" The tree line gave her nothing back. She stood there until the cold pushed her inside. And then she went and sat at the table and wrote in the journal and tried to make the pieces of this into a thing she could understand. She did not manage it that night. Or the next. But she was starting to understand that understanding it was going to require something from her that she had not given anything in a very long time, not certainty, not data, not method. Trust. Joseph Littlecloud did not look like a man who had spent 30 years in the Montana wilderness. He looked like someone's grandfather, which he was, and he was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee he had clearly been nursing for a while when Elena arrived at his house on a Wednesday morning in June with her notebook and her questions. She had found him through Leonard, who had said simply, "If you want to understand the Blackthorn Park's history, talk to Joseph. He knows things that are not in any file." Joseph was 71 years old. He had worked the Blackthorn Range as a parks ranger from his late 20s until his retirement 8 years ago, which meant he had been in that wilderness before Elena was born. He was a deliberate man, slow to speak but precise when he did, and when Elena explained why she had come, he did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had been waiting for someone to ask. He refilled both their coffees before he started talking. "I knew the Alpha you are calling Alpha K when he was 2 years old," Joseph said. "I was still active then, doing population counts in the eastern section. He was already something different from the others. Not aggressive. Just present. More present than other wolves. Like he was paying attention to more than they were." Elena wrote this down. "What do you mean by present?" she asked. Joseph thought about this. "Most animals," he said, "when they encounter a human in their territory, they are making a calculation. Threat or no threat. Run or stay. It is fast, and then it is done, and then they are doing something else. But this one, he would watch. He would watch for a long time. And he would not be making the threat calculation. He was past that. He was making a different kind of calculation." "What kind?" Joseph shrugged, but it was not a dismissive shrug. It was the kind of shrug that means, "I can describe the edges of it but not the center of it yet." He said, "His grandmother was something similar. We called her the Grey Mother. In the mid-90s there were 2 incidents with her. She led an injured hiker to a section of trail that was within radio range of our station. Only happened twice, both within the same year, and then she stopped. Or we stopped noticing. I was never sure which." Elena set down her pen. She made herself not speak immediately, because she had learned that the space after someone says something significant is the most valuable space in any conversation. Joseph looked at her steadily. "You are thinking, did she pass it on to her grandson?" "I am thinking it," Elena said. "It is a complicated question," Joseph said. "Wolves do not teach like humans teach. They do not sit down and explain things. But they live in close social groups across multiple generations, and what one animal learns shapes the choices it makes, which shapes the environment that the next generation grows up in. It is not genetics. It is not instruction. It is something in between that we do not have a clean word for." Elena nodded slowly. Joseph continued. "The Grey Mother was around your cabin's location," he said. "Not the cabin itself, the cabin was built after she was gone. But that ground. That stretch of the clearing along the eastern fence. She used that corridor regularly in her last 3 seasons. The park knew it. And Alfike's mother was born in those seasons." Elena was very still. She was doing the kind of math you do not write down. "He was brought up," she said slowly, "by an animal who had lived her whole adult life in close enough proximity to that location to develop a behavioral pattern around it. And that animal had a mother who had learned that a human at a fixed point could mean safety." Joseph said nothing. He was letting her work it through. She had also been the one, she said quietly, who had called in the rescue team when one of Africa's pack members was caught in a snare 2 years ago. She had found the juvenile by tracking the pack's distress behavior. She had radioed it in herself. She had waited with the animal until the team arrived. Yes, Joseph said. Elena told me about that. And the pack was there, she said. They watched the whole thing. Joseph nodded. So, Elena said, and she stopped and looked out Joseph's kitchen window at the neat rectangle of his garden, the beanpoles and the cold frames and the ordinary morning light on all of it. So, she continued, he did not choose me randomly. No, Joseph said. I do not think he did. Elena picked up her pen again. She did not write anything immediately. She was thinking about something she had been circling for months without being willing to land on it directly, and now she was going to land on it. The pattern is deliberate, she said. Not trained, not conditioned in any traditional sense, but deliberate. He assessed me. Over time. Through proximity, through observation, through watching how I behaved when one of his pack was in danger. And he made a decision. Yes, Joseph said, and his voice was not dramatic about it at all. He said it the way you say something that is both extraordinary and, now that you have arrived at it, obvious. But, Elena said, and here was the part she had not let herself say out loud yet, in any interview or meeting or conversation, the part that had been sitting in the back of her journal for 2 months. Joseph waited. If he made a decision about me, she said, then he has been directing the pack's behavior. Because it is not just him. It has been Mira, the young male, the black and gray female. Different individuals. And all of them bringing children to my specific location. He would have had to, she stopped. To show them, Joseph said. To show them what he had decided about me. Joseph looked at her with something that was not quite a smile but was in that direction. Wolves are not simple animals, Dr. Carr, he said. They never were. We made them simple in our minds because it was easier that way. But they have been watching us a very long time. Longer than we have been watching them. Elena sat with that for a moment. Then she asked the question that had been underneath all the other questions since the beginning. Why children, she said. Of all the things he could communicate, of all the ways this could have gone, why is he bringing me the youngest ones? The ones who can't get themselves out. Joseph set down his coffee cup. He looked at her with the directness of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors and had learned to say what was true without dressing it up. Because he learned to recognize distress, he said. And then he learned where to take it. Elena drove back to the cabin in the late afternoon. The sky was going orange over the mountains, and the shadows of the pine trees were long and blue across the road. She had 3 hours of daylight left, and she used them walking the perimeter of the park's eastern territory with her camera and her notebook and a mind that was very quiet in a way it had not been in a long time. She found Alfike's prints near the creek crossing at the base of the first ridge. They were fresh, that morning, maybe last night. Large, clean, the rear print slightly overlapping the front one the way his did, a distinctive gait she had documented across 2 winters. She crouched beside the prints and looked at them for a long time. Then she looked up at the ridge where the pack denayed, where she could not see him but where she was fairly certain he could see her. She had spent 11 years studying wolves as subjects. Objects of observation, sources of data, entries in a field log. And the whole time, without her knowing it, she had also been a subject. She had been observed, assessed, and assigned a role in a social structure she was not even aware she was part of. The thought should have been unsettling. She noticed that it was not. She stood up and continued along the track, and she wrote everything down, and the light got lower and the shadows got longer, and somewhere above her on the ridge the silver-gray alpha male of the Blackthorn pack was doing what he always did. Watching. By the time she got back to the cabin it was dark, and she turned the light on in the window as she always did, and she made tea, and she sat at the table and opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top she wrote, Proposed Study Framework, Interspecies Cooperative Behavior, Blackthorn Park. She sat back and looked at that line. Then she wrote, underneath it, Contact Dr. Priya Anand, Wildlife Genetics, University of Colorado. She looked at both lines together. Then she wrote a third, call Joseph tomorrow. Outside, the wilderness was quiet. The stars were very clear, which meant it would be cold overnight. She got up and checked the heating unit, which was working for once, and went to the window and looked out at the tree line for a moment before she turned in. She had come to the Blackthorn Reserve 3 years ago because she needed somewhere far from everything she had lost. She had come to study wolves. She had thought she was the one doing the studying. She was beginning to understand how much she had gotten wrong. Dr. Priya Anand arrived at the Blackthorn cabin on a Thursday morning in August with 3 bags of equipment, a graduate student named Ben who did not talk much but worked extremely fast, and an energy that Elena immediately understood was the energy of someone who had been waiting a long time for a problem like this one. Priya was 42, small, precise in every movement, with a habit of finishing her own sentences by writing the last word in the air with one finger. She had been studying wildlife genetics and behavioral ecology for 15 years. When she had contacted Elena 4 months earlier, she had introduced herself in a single short email that read, I have read every account of the Blackthorn incidents. I believe you are sitting on top of something significant. I would like to find out what it is, if you are willing. Elena had been willing. The study that Priya designed was careful in the way that good science is careful, patient, non-invasive, rigorous in its documentation. They were not going to do anything that harmed or stressed the pack. They were going to observe, record, and measure. They were going to collect environmental scent data, movement pattern data, and behavioral correlation data across a defined period. They had full ethics approval from the university and from the relevant wildlife authorities. It had taken 4 months to get to this point, and Priya had moved through every step of that process with the focus calm of someone who understood that the process was the work. On the first day, Priya walked the perimeter of the territory with Elena and said almost nothing, just looked and listened and took photographs and occasionally crouched to examine a print or a scratch mark on a tree or a depression in the ground that meant nothing to most people but apparently meant something to her. At the end of the day she sat at Elena's table and said, he has been watching this cabin for at least 2 years. Maybe more. I can see it in the movement patterns. He approaches the perimeter regularly, at intervals that are too consistent to be random. He is not hunting in this area. He is returning to it. Elena looked at her. I know, she said. You knew? I suspected. I have been logging his approach intervals since last winter. I did not have the framework to say what they meant. Priya made a note. Then she looked up. What do you think they mean? She said. Elena thought about how to say it in the language of evidence rather than the language of feeling, because feeling was not what this conversation required. I think he has identified this location as significant, she said. And I think he has been monitoring it the way he monitors the key points in his territory. The way he monitors a water source or a boundary marker. Methodically. Repeatedly. And the children. Elena was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, she kept her voice level, the way she had learned to do when the thing she was saying was the thing she was most uncertain about. I think the children are not an accident, she said. I think he learned to recognize the signs of a person who is lost and in danger. I think that came from his lineage, from patterns established before he was born. And I think at some point he decided where to bring that. He decided where help came from. Priya looked at her steadily. He decided it was here, Elena said. Priya nodded once, slowly. Then she said, let us find out if the data agrees. The data, when it came, took 18 months to compile and 6 months after that to analyze and write up. During those 2 years Elena and Priya spent more time together than apart, and Ben turned out to be one of the most careful field technicians Elena had ever worked with, and Leonard Cole provided access and logistical support and a kind of steady, undemanding presence that was more useful than he probably knew. The scent behavior correlation mapping was the core of the study. What they were looking for was evidence that the pack had developed distinct behavioral responses to specific scent signatures, and specifically, whether Elena's scent signature functioned differently in pack behavior from other human scent signatures they encountered in the territory. The results were, as Priya put it when she first reviewed the full dataset, unprecedented in the published literature. Alpha K had developed what the paper would call an associative trust profile around Elena's scent. The behavioral markers that distinguished his pack's response to her presence from their response to any other human scent source in the territory were consistent, measurable, and statistically significant. The pack relaxed near her in ways they did not relax near other humans. The alert behaviors that typically accompanied human presence were reduced or absent. And in 3 of the 5 child retrieval incidents, the approach route taken by the pack member involved had passed directly through areas of high Elena scent concentration before diverging toward the lost child's location and then back again. They had not been wandering and found the child. They had been traveling, and the route had taken them through the territory in a way that was organized around Elena's presence as a reference point. But the finding that stopped both of them, that made Priya put down her pen and sit back and say nothing for nearly a full minute, was the second one. In 3 of the 5 child retrieval cases, follow-up analysis of the environmental conditions and the children's physical states at time of discovery showed that the children had been in genuine medical danger. Not just lost. Not just cold and frightened. 2 were in the early stages of dangerous exposure. 1 had consumed berries from a plant that, had another 2 or 3 hours passed without intervention, would have required hospital treatment. And in all 3 of those cases, the time between the pack locating the child and the child reaching Elena's cabin was the shortest route possible given the terrain. Not the easiest route. The shortest. The wolves had not stumbled upon distress and reacted. They had moved toward it with urgency that the tracking data could quantify. Priya said, when she was ready to speak, they can detect physiological distress. Probably through scent, cortisol, metabolic change, the chemistry of fear and cold and illness. We knew wolves could do this in principle, but the consistency here, and the directed response, is not something we have documented at this level before. Elena was looking at the data on the laptop screen. She was thinking about Daisy in the yellow raincoat, not crying, just sitting. She was thinking about Oliver and his broken ankle and the look on his face when she came over the ridge. She said, he built a system. Priya looked at her. Alpha K, Elena said. Over time, with information he gathered from his environment and his lineage and his own observations, he built a system for responding to a particular kind of event in his territory. He identified the event, a vulnerable young person in danger. He identified the response, bring them to the fixed point where help comes from. And he distributed that response through his pack so that it did not depend on him being the one to execute it. Priya was very still. That is what the paper will say. Elena asked. That is what the data shows, Priya said quietly. Yes. They sat together in the small cabin with the field data on the screen between them and the Montana evening coming on outside the window, and neither of them spoke for a long time, because there are moments when the correct response to what you have found is not words. The paper was published in a peer-reviewed journal the following spring. It was called Associative Trust Formation and Directed Retrieval Behavior in Canis lupus, a longitudinal field study of the blackthorn pack. Elena and Priya were listed as co-authors, with Ben as third author and Joseph as a named contributor in the acknowledgements, which Joseph said he preferred. The response was significant. Other researchers contacted them within days. Several journalists ran stories that were more measured than the original wave, because now there was a paper. 2 wildlife documentary companies reached out, and Elena declined both of them, and Priya declined on behalf of the study, and that was the end of that. But the finding that Elena came back to, again and again, in the months after publication, was not the associative trust data or the retrieval route analysis or even the distress detection finding. It was something smaller. Something that had not even been part of the original study design. In the course of compiling the movement data, Ben had cross-referenced the timing of Alpha K's perimeter monitoring visits to the cabin with the full incident timeline going back to Elena's first winter at the Blackthorn station. And he had found that the regular perimeter visits had begun not in the months before the first retrieval, but 14 months before it. Before anything had happened. Before Mira had brought Daisy to the fence. Alpha K had been watching the cabin for over a year before the first child arrived. He had been assessing Elena for 14 months before he acted on whatever conclusion he had reached. Elena read that section of Ben's data 3 times. She thought about what Joseph had said. Wolves have been watching us a long time. She thought about the snare rescue, and the pack in the trees watching her kneel beside their juvenile and wait with him in the cold until the rescue team arrived. She thought about the first time she had seen Alfie, 2 winters ago, at the edge of the eastern ridge at dusk. She had been alone and he had been alone, and they had looked at each other across about 60 meters of snow for nearly 4 minutes. She had written in her log, extended visual contact, no threat behavior, subject departed west. No anomalous features. She had thought she was the one doing the observing. She had been wrong for 14 months. She closed the laptop and sat in the quiet of the cabin and felt something she did not have a precise word for, not pride, not awe, not even wonder exactly, though it held pieces of all of those. It was closer to the feeling of being seen. Of being known, not by a person, but by something older and quieter and more patient than people usually manage to be. She had come here 3 years ago, alone and diminished in ways she had not admitted to anyone, and she had brought her notebooks and her data and her professional language and her careful distances. And a wolf on a ridge above the eastern creek had looked at her across 60 meters of snow and had begun, in his methodical and unhurried way, to make up his mind about her. And then he had trusted her with the most important things in his world. She was not sure she had ever been given something like that before. Alfie died on a Sunday in the 3rd winter of the study. Elena found the pack's location data on her tracking screen early in the morning. They had clustered overnight in the upper eastern territory, near the high ridge where they rarely denayed in winter. The clustering pattern was distinctive. She had seen it twice before, in other packs, and she knew what it meant. She went out in the early light. It was the kind of cold that made the air feel thin, that turned every breath into a small visible cloud. She moved through the snow on the trail to the ridge carefully, not hurrying, giving the pack space. When she came to the edge of the ridge's lower slope, she stopped. Alfie was in the snow beneath a stand of pines. The pack was arranged around him in the way that wolf packs arrange themselves around a sick or dying member, present, close, but giving him the center of the space. Mira was nearest to him. She had been his closest female companion through the 3 years Elena had studied him. Elena stayed at the tree line. She did not approach. She watched for a long time, until the cold pushed its way through her coat, and she did not take notes and she did not use her camera. He died before noon. She knew by the shift in the pack's behavior, the way they moved and stilled and moved again, the sound that began and then quieted. She stayed until it was quiet, and then she walked back down to the cabin. She called Priya from the table. Then she called Joseph. Neither of them said much. There was not much to say that the facts did not already hold. She entered the date and location in the research log. Then she opened her personal journal, the one she had started the night Mira brought Daisy out of the snow, and she sat for a long time before she wrote anything. What she wrote in the end was not long. She wrote, "I did not expect to grieve a wolf I never touched. But I find that I am. He was the most deliberate being I have ever had the privilege of being observed by. And I believe he knew exactly what he was doing, all of it, from the beginning. I hope that is something. I think it is everything." The pack remained in the Blackthorn territory. They did not disperse. Mira took a more central role in the pack's movements, which was not entirely unexpected given the social dynamics Elena had been tracking. The structure held. The retrieval stopped after Alfie's death. Not immediately. There was one incident 2 months later, a boy found near the south boundary and brought to the cabin fence by a young female, and Elena had taken the boy inside and waited with him, and his family had been found within the hour. But after that, nothing. Whether the behavior pattern would emerge again in the next generation, whether it had transferred the way it had from the Grey Mother through Alfie's lineage, was a question the study could not yet answer. Elena wrote it into the longitudinal proposal as a central research question. The study was now funded for another 8 years. She had been offered a professorship at the University of Colorado. She had been offered a book deal by a publisher in New York. She had been offered the kind of recognition that most researchers in her field spend their careers working toward and many never reached. She declined the professorship. She declined the book deal, though she said she might reconsider the book someday, when she had more of the answer and less of the question. She accepted 2 things, the longitudinal study funding, and an invitation to speak at a wildlife research conference in Denver, where she stood in front of 300 researchers and said something that was not the kind of thing usually said at wildlife research conferences. She said, "I came to the Blackthorn Reserve to study wolves. What I discovered is that I was also being studied. I want to suggest to you that this is not unusual, that the animals we observe are observing us constantly, that they are drawing conclusions and making decisions and building patterns of response that are shaped by what they see in us. We have spent decades designing better methods for watching wildlife. We have spent very little time asking what wildlife makes of what it sees when it watches us." She paused there. She said, "The Blackthorn Park's alpha male spent 14 months assessing me before he trusted me with anything. 14 months of quiet, consistent observation. He was looking for something specific. I believe he found it. I believe what he found was this: here is a person who stays. Here is a person who shows up in the cold and the dark and does not run. Here is a person who, when one of my own was in danger, did not walk away." She paused again. "I want to be honest with you," she said, "about what it felt like to discover that. It felt like being handed something you did not know you had been working toward. It felt like being held to a standard you had not consciously set but had, apparently, been meeting. A wolf on a ridge decided that I was someone who could be trusted. And then he put that decision into action, again and again, until I understood what he was telling me." She let that sit for a moment. She said, "The least I could do was not let the light go out." She meant it both ways when she said it, and the people in the room understood both. After the conference, she drove back north. The whole drive up through Colorado and into Montana, the sky got bigger and the trees got taller and the roads got quieter. By the time she was on the last stretch to the cabin, there was no other traffic and the mountains were going blue with afternoon shadow and she was exactly where she wanted to be. She pulled into the clearing. She got out of the car and stood for a moment in the cold air, looking at the tree line. The cabin light was on. She had left it on the whole time she was gone. 3 days, and the light in the window had been on the whole time, because it had become a thing she did not know how to stop doing. Mira was at the fence. Elena went still. Mira was standing at the same post she had stood at the first night, the November night 3.5 years ago when everything had started. She was older now, her muzzle was graying, her movement a little slower. But she was there, and she was looking at Elena with the same expression that Elena had never been able to assign a simple word to. Not threat. Not submission. Not play or hunger or any of the categories she had been taught. Something more like recognition. They looked at each other across the clearing for a long moment. Then Mira turned and walked back into the dark trees, and Elena watched until she was gone, and then she went inside and put the kettle on and opened her journal to a new page and picked up her pen. She had a lot of work still to do. The park was moving into a new chapter, and so was the study, and so was she. There were years ahead of data and questions and careful observation and the slow, patient work of understanding. But first she wrote one line at the top of the blank page. She wrote, "I will keep the light on." And she meant it.